Here we go, grade 6 on history part 2. You have a little bit more reading to do. You're going to watch this video and then you're going to fill in a few more blanks on page 28. So where we left off last time, the United States had just become officially a country. Remember, before it was a group of British colonies. Now it has broken away from Britain. Remember, they won the Revolutionary War and they've made their own country. They have their own president, their own government. They are their own country separate from Britain. Now, one thing that we should mention that I don't think I've mentioned yet is that up in Canada, or what would become Canada, the British are still in control, okay? You see what I'm highlighting here? Canada at the time was known as British North America. It hadn't officially become a country yet. The United States became a country before Canada did. So at the time in early American history, when they've just become a nation, Canada is still under control of the British. It's still technically a colony controlled by European leaders. Now, as time went on, the United States, they started expanding. You'll notice even over here, right? Originally, we had the 13 colonies just along this side. You'll see that it has expanded its territory. And then in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the men who was influential in creating and signing the Declaration of Independence, he was at the time the president. And what he did was he negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. So if you look right here, this section of what does become part of the United States, that used to be under the control of France, and Thomas Jefferson bought that land for the United States. So you'll notice that the United States started over here and is really growing westward as time goes on, gaining more and more territory. And then something else to be aware of too is that there are other European powers at play. So this part of the United States, and even what is today Mexico, was controlled by Spain. And if you think about it, it makes a whole lot of sense. If you think about this is Mexico, people in Mexico speak Spanish, and the reason that they speak Spanish is because their country was controlled by Spain for many, many years. So that's just a little bit of historical reasoning for that as well. So the United States growing and expanding. Now, on the map that we just looked at, it's important to note here that there's a large group of people that are missing from the map, right? We talk about the British, we talk about, you know, the Louisiana Purchase area was French. This area belonged or was controlled by Spain. We need to always remember that there were people living in this land that were there first, okay? So the Aboriginal or the First Nations or the Native Americans were the first people who were living there, and all of these different European countries that were struggling for power and struggling for territory, what was happening was the native peoples were getting pushed off of their land, being forced away from where they had lived and where their ancestors had lived by the new settlers and the new colonists that were all coming in at this time, by those people who had created the United States of America and broken away from the British government. So just to be aware that these native peoples, they didn't just disappear, that they were often forced to live on what are called reservations, and a lot of those still exist today. A lot of native peoples, even in Canada, live on reserves or reservations. So just to be aware that that is a major cultural component of what's happening here as well. So we have these European nations that are fighting for power, but it's also having an effect on a large group of people who lived in North America first as well. Now, another group that we haven't mentioned are the Loyalists. So throughout this time, and actually even starting back in the time of the Revolutionary War, there's a group of people who wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown. That's why they're called Loyalists, okay? They wanted to obey the British government and the British king, and they didn't want to separate from Britain. So what ended up happening was these Loyalists started moving to places where they were accepted and where other people wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown. So a lot of people who started out living in those colonies and living in the United States of America ended up moving up to British North America. Because remember, British North America, what would become Canada, was loyal to Britain still. Okay, and just some interesting history here. This is a map of where we live. We live, right, well, not quite that big area, but that's the area we live. And a lot of the loyalists came from the United States and settled there, or even on the northern part of Lake Ontario. If you've heard of Kingston, Ontario, that was a town that was started by the loyalists, right? Kingstown. They want to remain loyal to the king. So just something to be aware of as well, that the people who were loyal to the British Crown, they started moving up into Canada over these years, or what would become Canada, and basically made Canada even more loyal to the British Crown. So they decided to leave the United States because they wanted to remain loyal to Britain, and the people up in Canada, or what would become Canada, wanted to remain loyal to Britain, so they settled there together. All right, so we're jumping ahead a little bit in history as well to the War of 1812. So the Americans, I've got to jump back to this map again. It's got lots of stuff on it. Hopefully you can still kind of see what's happening here. They really wanted to expand their territory across all of North America. So they were expanding their territory west. Oh, I don't know what I just did. I moved some highlighting somehow. They were expanding their territory west, but they also started looking to the north. So they started looking to the north and thinking, well, they want to expand their territory. And they also, remember, the Americans, they didn't like the British, right? They had thrown off the British. They wanted to be separate. They thought, wouldn't it be nice to go and free the people of British North America from those evil British rulers? And that was essentially what started the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the United States invading British North America, what would become Canada. It's not quite Canada yet, and trying to essentially kick out the British. And the War of 1812, it's called the War of 1812, but it actually lasted for a few years. It ended in 1814, so a couple years, not just 1812. And it ended with General Sir Isaac Brock. There he is. His name should sound familiar. There's a university nearby that's named after him. He was a British general, and he led the British troops to victory against the Americans. And it was kind of a situation where it was against all odds. The Americans really expected to win. They outnumbered the British, and they really thought this was going to be, they could kind of just waltz in and take over. But that didn't end up happening. So, as a result, Canada and the United States remained separate. Okay, so if the War of 1812 were to be won by the Americans, we could assume that Canada would have become part of the United States, so one big country. But that's not what happened. The War of 1812 was won by the British, and the Americans were forced back into their own country. So that's the War of 1812. Oh, and I guess I should mention, it's one of your fill in the blanks. The Treaty of Ghent was in 1814, and that treaty was really just a treaty that divided the United States from British North America, or the United States from modern day Canada. So as a result of the War of 1812, two separate countries. So let's jump back to America again. I know I keep mentioning Canada here, but we talked about at the beginning of our unit on the United States that we have a lot of shared history. So Canada keeps, jumping back into the story. So let's go back to the United States, to something that you have learned about before recently in the historical context video for Roll of Thunder. We talked about the Civil War. So I'm just going to very briefly go over it once again, now that we know what's happening within the rest of American history. So, like I mentioned in that other video, these southern states down here, what they had was an economy, or what they had was basically the way that they made money was through those cotton plantations. And they needed a lot of slave labor to run those cotton plantations. You needed a lot of manpower to grow and harvest cotton and to make money on it. And what they had decided to do, and that's the reason why there's a gap in between here, what they decided to do was to try and break off of the United States and make their own country rather than give up owning slaves. Because if they gave up owning slaves, they knew it would mean financial ruin for them, that they would lose a lot of money, they would lose their way of supporting themselves. So they decided instead to try and break away from the United States. And what ended up happening was the northern states fought with the southern states over a number of years. And it was a terrible battle, and it's a civil war. I think I mentioned in the last video is a war within a country. So it's a country that's fighting against itself. Okay, so the southern states, they wanted to keep slavery. The northern states, they wanted to get rid of, or the fancy word is abolish slavery. So they were fighting about that. And what ended up happening was the northern states won the Civil War, which meant that the United States stayed one country and slavery was abolished. It was outlawed. It wasn't legal to own to own slaves anymore. And then just one more thing. We're jumping back over to Canada again. So you're going to learn more about Canadian history with Mr. Worston next year. You're going to actually spend, I think, maybe even half a year or so learning in detail about Canadian history, but it's just always good to be aware of what's happening in Canada at the same time as what's happening in the United States. So the Civil War ended in 1865, and actually the next year, Canada officially became a country. And if you look at this map, it was just this pinkish section was officially Canada at the start. And part of the reason that Canada, or that people in Canada moved to become their own nation, was because they were made a little bit nervous by the American Civil War. That the Americans, they had a lot of soldiers, they had a lot of military bases, things like that. They were thinking back to the War of 1812 and thinking, well, the United States invaded once, could they do it again and try to take over? So that was sort of part of what prompted Canada to even become an official country. So just an interesting connection between our histories there. And I think that's all I have to say to you for today. We will continue.